So thank you very much, IIT Gandhinagar. It's one of my most favorite IITs because it has a very good cognitive science department. I've been there several times, and the energy among the youngsters there is really, really immense. And it's a privilege to be participating today here in your Brain Awareness Week. What I'll be talking about today is bilingualism and its link to cognition. This is what I've been asked to talk about. I wear many hats. This is one of my most exciting and controversial hat, as you will see in the next 45 minutes or so. So I bring you greetings from Bangalore. Now, for any of you who belong to Karnataka, you would have grown up eating the masala dosa, reading Kannada, speaking Kannada, that is Namaskara in Kannada. You would have also seen this beautiful Rangoli that we see women draw in front of their homes as an auspicious symbol. Many of you from across India and even across the world would have visited Hampi, which is in Karnataka. Childhood memories of the Mysore Dasara festival, which you might have watched on television. You might have even visited Mysore to watch. And now we know that most of the people who are steeped in the IT culture, who code, who do anything to do with biotechnology are in Bangalore. So this is Bangalore. And this is what the people of Bangalore remember, do, cook, and speak. But what happens when this disease called dementia takes over the brain? All these cognitive processes are broken down. People can no longer remember what they used to do. Complex skills will be forgotten, won't be able to recognize such famous monuments, will forget how to read and write. And this is where cognition links to, for all of you who are studying cognition in so many different ways, whether it's neuroscience or cognitive science, whether you're engineers or linguists or social science students, humanities, artists, musicians, all of you will link in some way or the other to cognition and will empathize with people who have cognitive impairment. And when there is cognitive impairment due to brain disease, we call this dementia. And as you can see, people will forget. So there's a memory loss, inability to speak, comprehend what is being told to them, read and write, impairment of the cognitive domain called language, difficulties with paying attention for day-to-day activities, attentional problems, spatial cognition may be affected. They don't know how to find their way around, don't know how to orient themselves to structures around, even sitting on a chair, or how to hold a phone. All of these motor skilled activities and spatial cognition may be affected. Executive functioning, ability to plan, organize, and complete an activity error-free in a time-bound manner. Praxis, motor skilled activity, and behavior. Knowing how to behave appropriately in social situations, ability to understand emotional responses of others, ability to understand another person's perspective. Do you feel what they feel? Do you understand what they feel? All these are cognitive domains, and any of these cognitive domains can get affected due to brain disease. And when this affects day-to-day life, we call this dementia. I'm sure most of you here who are in cognitive science know that many of these cognitive domains, they map on to specific areas in the brain, specific networks in the brain. And while there are regions that are localized for each of these functions, there's a fair amount of overlap between brain areas that subserve these functions. So as you can see, cognitive impairment due to dementia can be quite complex and can have a very debilitating effect on people. And any disease of the brain can affect cognition. It could be stroke, When the blood supply to the brain is depleted, could be head injury, could be epilepsy, could be a brain tumor, could be inflammation, infection, degeneration. So anything really that affects the brain can affect cognition and produce dementia. I'm a clinical neurologist. I'm a clinician, stumbled into the world of research to find solutions for patients like this that I see. And my purpose today is to really encourage among all of you who are scientists, who are going to become scientists, or in any field, policy, any field, management, computer science, there is a huge burden of people with this disease, and they're all waiting for your very young brains to work on how to reduce the burden of dementia. And as you can see, 1 every 3 seconds is diagnosed to have some form of cognitive impairment and dementia. This red graph here, you will see that burden is rising, more so in low and middle income countries like ours. But the good news is that in high income countries, the burden is actually stabilizing, some indication that there is even maybe a slight reduction in incidence. How is this happening? So this is a very famous and hopeful study that happened in 1988, sorry, this is a mistake. So in the Rush Aging and Memory Study in Chicago, what scientists did was they followed hundreds of people who lived in nursing homes when they were well, and for several decades they followed them up and they assessed their cognition very periodically, once in 2 years. And when they died, all of these residents donated their brain for research. So you have this huge brain bank of people. You knew how they were when they were alive, and over several years, you watch them being healthy, being diseased, brain disease, non-brain disease. But we've understood their life, and then we looked at their brains. So that was the Rush Aging. That kind of study is what Kurtzman did in 1988. I'm sorry, the Rush study came later. And in this study, they found that in nearly 10% of people who had brain changes of Alzheimer's disease or dementia, cognitively, they were still intact. So what does that suggest? That the brain, there can be pathology in the brain, but it need not always manifest as severe cognitive impairment. And this, they use the term cognitive reserve to actually indicate that there was some form of reserve that the brain had that protected it from developing disease. So this is the hope, that there can be disease and still there can be some form of protection. We talk about brain, we talk about banks where we store money, we buy real estate, we even buy chocolates and keep it in the fridge so we can eat it later. But this is the kind of reserve that we really need to build. And this is the concept of cognitive reserve, where we can resist disease and become more resilient to disease. So this is actually now the area of intense research to find out what can one do in one's life to protect oneself from developing disease, and what are the mechanisms that underlie this this effect that life course factors have on neurodegenerative processes. Education. This is kind of something that has come up as the most important factor that protects the brain from the effects of brain disease. Complex occupations, complex leisure activities, and physical activity. All of these life course experiences are now thought to build cognitive reserve. So why am I talking about this? Does bilingualism matter? What is bilingualism? Bilingualism or multilingualism or trilingualism, I'm using them all in the same context, is our ability to speak more than one language. It is something that in India we all take for granted. I'm sure every person in the audience now can speak more than one language. It's not a big deal for us. But at that time, when people were trying to understand cognitive reserve, there was this one study by Ellen Bialystok, where she showed in a memory clinic that people who spoke more than one language had a later age at onset of dementia. So you can see monolinguals, 72 years. Bilinguals, 76.5 years. Now, a little bit of background. While we take bilingualism for granted, and we don't know if it's useful or not, we know why do I enjoy the fact that I speak another language? Because I can speak to speakers of that language. It helps me when I go to Delhi. I can talk to the taxi driver in Hindi. If I go to Calcutta, I can speak to the person in the mishti shop, in the sweet shop in Bengali. If I go to Tamil Nadu, I can order a masala dosa in the restaurant Sharavana Bhava quite happily. But is that all that bilingualism does? Little bit of context. In the 1923, there was a paper in a journal of psychology, which demonstrated or which said that speaking more than one language is actually bad for the brain. This was Sayre, 1923, Journal of Psychology. And it was thought that being able to speak more than one language is actually harmful for the brain. There were several reasons for this, and a lot of these studies came from English-speaking nations. This particular one was from England, where they looked at people who spoke Welsh, and they said that it may not be all that very good for the brain to learn another language. But subsequently, from the 1960s onwards, there have been little attempts, and then now more attempts, and many more attempts, where they actually demonstrated that children who could speak more than one language had more mental flexibility, and they had more cognitive control, and they were probably in some form, their cognition and the way their cognitive processes were organized were different from children who spoke only one language, and in some ways may actually even be better. But there were not many takers for this concept, but evidence was slowly building up. At this time, Ellen Bialystok, who also did many of these studies, went to her neurologist and said, can we look at the age at onset of dementia in bilinguals? And that was brilliant, really. And they found that, you can see here, nearly a 4.5-year delay in the age at onset of dementia. That was one of the landmark papers that we all read at that time. And what we now think is that a life of resolving cross-language competition appears to confer positive consequences for cognition, and then changes to the brain networks. And this is actually, they reflect the way in which we perform cognitive control processes. Now, this is the Simon task. I'm sure most of you who've studied cognitive science know this. It's very easy to press the red button on the left-sided button for red if the red square comes on the same side, but that's a congruent trial. But if the red square comes on the opposite side and you still have to press the left-sided button, you have to kind of inhibit the green square that is on the same side as the hand, and then you have to press the red button on the left side. Now, this is an incongruent trial. And it appears that people who speak more than one language are actually better at this task. They're better at inhibiting responses, irrelevant responses. And this is thought to be because we are constantly shifting from one language to another, and we are therefore able to suppress one language when we are activating the other language or when we are switching. And this manifests in the cognitive control task, the Simon task. So this is Ellen Bialystok. There are many, this is her book, and she's written chapters. There are many YouTube videos. I advise all of you to go back and listen to what she has to say on bilingualism. Albert Costa, he's no more now. He was one of the icons of bilingual cognitive psychology research, and did a lot of work, and this is one particular study based on the attention network task, which showed that bilinguals had an advantage over monolinguals. The theory now that underlies a lot of our bilingual work is the adaptive control hypothesis that has been put forward by Green and Abutalebi. And I would like you to just read these, the aspects of cognitive control that bilinguals are probably better at: goal maintenance, interference control, salient cue detection, selective response inhibition, task disengagement, task engagement, opportunistic planning. So you can see here that people who are in an interactional context of dual languages, when you're talking to another person and he knows two languages, you know two languages, or you're talking to two people, one who knows one language and the other who knows another language. So in this kind of context, the cognitive control processes are much more active when we are dealing with two languages, and then more so when we're actually switching between one language and the other in the conversation. So these are again some of the several studies that have demonstrated the main tests that have been used are response inhibition tasks, the flanker task, Simon task, attention network task, the go, no-go task. And there are some studies that have demonstrated that if one is actually a balanced switching bilingual, so you know both languages equally well, then the advantage to cognitive control tasks is better. Similarly, so in the go, no-go task. But coming back to what a neurologist is doing in this field, a doctor, we entered the field to pop pills and make people better. But then we had this disease called dementia, which doesn't have a cure today. So we don't have a pill that can make them better. So when we're talking about a delay of about 5 years that Ellen Bialystock showed, we're talking about a man who might be 60 years old, developing dementia, or developing it when he's 65 years old. So you can imagine in the lifespan of a human being, 60 and 65 is huge. His retirement, children's weddings, holidays. There are so many important life course activities that we fulfill at that age. So even a 5-year delay in the absence of any cure is a big thing. So this is something that was felt to be an important avenue to pursue. But then what did the other diseases find? And there was a lot of criticism as well. Because Ellen Bialystock's study was done in Canada, it was felt that the bilinguals there were immigrants, so maybe it is the healthy migrant effect. Bilinguals were often more educated than monolinguals, or sometimes less educated than monolinguals. So was it a kind of a confounding factor of education? And there was this one study by Howard Chetkoff from Canada again, that demonstrated that you have to know at least 3 languages, and 2 languages were not enough. And then this other study, which demonstrated that bilingualism was helpful, but in low educated people, but not in high educated people. So a little bit of the importance of studying confounding variables and variability in results emerged around this time. The reason I am presenting this to all of you is it is, you might start off your career in one field, but then life takes you to some other area. And then it's so important and you might find solutions from other areas in science or in humanities or in arts. So this was one such example, which I will show you now we did about 7 or maybe 9 or 10 studies so far. And I'll trace my journey with these studies. And you will see it took us to all kinds of very exciting places. So my advice to the youngsters who are here is just work in an interdisciplinary manner, take up the challenge that is relevant to society today. And I think the journey is so exciting and challenging. And I hope in the next 7 or 8 studies that we have done, you will be convinced of this. So in this background, we were seeing patients with dementia in India. And India is a very linguistically diverse country. We all speak more than 2 or 3 languages. There are thousands of languages that are spoken, and many of us are bilinguals. And it's quite normal to be a bilingual in our country. And why is this so? For centuries, we have been bilingual, trilingual. This is a map from the 17th century of India. You can see different parts of India. You have the Mysore state, but ruled by Hyder Ali. You have the Hyderabad state, which is very much Telugu, but then there was a Nizam, it was called the Nizam's dominion, the Carnatic, which is actually Tamil Nadu now, and then you have Travancore, Heartland, Hindi, Bengal, and so many dialects and languages that are spoken in the eastern part of India, Gujarat, Rajasthan, Punjab, and in Kashmir. So you can see that we have been for centuries a very bilingual, multilingual society. And therefore, it just seemed very natural for us to kind of study this. Now, this is for us normal, but when I show this slide to an international audience, it always evokes some kind of interest. But I think, so this is how we write our lists of things to buy. We mix up languages. I learned my vegetables in Telugu, but I learned some of my the things like biscuits and soaps in English. And that's how we read. We read newspapers of all three languages. Different newspapers will give us a different slant on the political situation. So we are bilingual in our day-to-day life. We switch from languages depending on how we use them. This is Shailaja, my PhD student who did all her work with me, or I worked with her. And this is a 10th standard certificate. You can see we all learned 3 languages. In Hyderabad, this is Telugu, Dakhini. Dakhini is a form of Urdu and English. There were 78 other mother tongues in our memory clinic cohort that we saw. And this is because we have a mixture multicultural population in Hyderabad. This is a memory clinic in Hyderabad where I used to work. And this is the Grossian's theory of bilingualism. Skilled bilinguals rarely make the error of speaking the wrong language, yet they often code switch with other similar bilinguals in the middle of a sentence, suggesting that they possess an exquisite mechanism of cognitive control. So this will be me with a patient who speaks Telugu, with her daughter who's an IT professional who speaks English, with her ayah who speaks a dialect of Telugu, my psychologist. We mix Telugu, English, and Hindi together, and therefore this is something that's very normal for us. But it is not so in most Western English-speaking countries. So we asked this question: is bilingualism associated with a delay in the age at onset of dementia? And the advantage with studying an Indian population is immigration is not a problem. We are not immigrants. Bilinguals are not immigrants. Education, we have people who are very low educated but still speak 2 languages. We can have high educated people who can speak only 1 language. Socioeconomic status, across poor and not so rich and middle class people speak 2 languages. So we can actually account for many of the confounding factors. And we had seen by then 648 dementia patients in Hyderabad in the memory clinic. We had done tests in the language of the patients. We defined age at onset of dementia as the age at which the first time the family member noticed that there was a memory loss. We were all very excited when we started out this research, when I saw my first dementia patient, this was not on my cards. All we did was systematically collect information about the patient, and it happened to include how many languages do they speak. And I owe a lot of my work to the young psychologists who worked with me, because for every patient, they collected information about the languages that they spoke. And this was done even before. This was done in 2006, when actually Bailey-Stokes' paper was not even published then. So this is again an indication that you have to keep trying and understand your patient cohort as much as possible, and solutions will emerge from the most unexpected of places. But when you can all imagine, we were sitting there and we had this data and we didn't know what was going to happen. We looked at their age at onset. So this is how we define bilinguals, as people who could speak, who could. This is Mohanty. He is one of our iconic figures from Orissa who's worked tribals in Orissa. And they've all now, and showed that studied a pattern of bilingualism in the Indian context. And this is his work is the basis also now for the national education policy, where people understand that children have to learn their concepts in their mother tongue. So how he defined bilingualism, which is very contextually relevant for the Indian context, and therefore we used his definition. And this is another person I'd like to acknowledge, Vasanta. She was a professor of applied linguistics in Osmania University. You need friends in research. You need to have good mentors in research. And you really need to work collaboratively with people. Now you can see I'm working now with a linguist. And she was actually somebody who introduced us to the concept of bilingualism, not as a black and white concept, but more as a nuanced concept. And this is the language we studied. The first thing we did, even before studying bilingualism, was we looked at the language use in our population. So we had a language use questionnaire. We we asked several hundreds of people how they use their languages. And you can see the first graph is of people who spoke Telugu at home. And this is a graph of people who spoke Urdu at home. And the people who spoke Telugu at home, although they mostly spoke Telugu, they mixed up English, they mixed up Hindi. But in more informal situations, like with their friends, there was much more of mixing of languages, and more so in formal situations like college or at work. And the pattern differed whether they spoke Telugu at home or whether they spoke Urdu at home, depending upon which language is more commonly spoken in society. So having done this, we looked at our memory clinic data. You can see there were more than 250 people who spoke one language, but several who spoke 2, 3, and 4 or more languages. So then what did we find? We found that the age at onset of dementia among monolinguals was 61 years. And we found the age at onset of dementia for bilinguals or multilinguals was 65.6 years. Very similar to what Ellen Bialystok found. We found this when we had 347 patients. We found this when we had 450 patients. So when we had at 345, we didn't have the confidence to publish. This is also building confidence among researchers who want to publish. We said, no, let's see some more patients. We do not want to say something prematurely. And then we had 648 patients, and that effect was still there. And the association was still there. This is not an effect. This is just an association. People who spoke more than one language, their age at onset of dementia was 4.7 years later than people who spoke one language. But then we looked at our monolinguals and bilinguals. Our bilinguals, yes, they had a later age at onset, but they were more often men, more often educated, more often lived in urban areas, more often engaged in occupations that were more complex. So was it an effect of any one of this? Is the bilingual effect actually an effect of one of these? Then we did a general linear model, and we found that none of these confounding factors had a significant interaction with bilingualism, suggesting that it was independently associated with a later age at onset of dementia. Since there were previous studies that the number of languages mattered, we looked at the number of languages, 1, 2, 3, 4, no difference. Did it matter which native language they spoke? Native Telugu, Dakkini, Hindi? There seemed to be no difference. It was across all native languages. Now, I'm telling, again, only describing my journey. Within, I think on the same day it was published, this became the official press release of the American Academy of Neurology. And this paper pretty much went viral, and it was reported in practically every vernacular across the world. This is the BBC World Service, the radio, the television. It was very overwhelming. One does not want science to get into popular science. Those of us who are in science, we know that science is best kept within the scientific domain. It can be communicated, but popular science is just that, it's popular. And we were very worried when this happened. But we realized that they were actually not talking so much about our study. They were talking about themselves being bilingual. It was a ray of hope for so many societies across the world. What we heard from them was that it was disadvantageous for the brain, felt that there was some kind of hope in being able to speak more than one language, and that was maybe helpful for the brain. Now, this was within 2 weeks of publishing this paper. There was a letter to the editor saying that the data are not sufficient to draw this conclusion. Journey of science. And the author here, Professor James Mortimer, correctly so, said that your bilinguals are lower education, they come from rural areas, it's a clinic-based study, therefore inherently biased. So we really can't support this conclusion. So this gave us an opportunity to go back. Now we had bilinguals and monolinguals that were illiterate. Unfortunately, India still has a large proportion of illiterates. So we looked only at the illiterate people. And we found that even among illiterates, if you were bilingual, there was a delay in age at onset of dementia, 65 years for illiterate bilinguals and 59 years for 65 for literate bilinguals and 59 for illiterate bilinguals. Similarly, so we went into only rural population. We removed effect of urban. We just thought, okay, let's look at the village, people who live in villages. Similarly, rural population that spoke, people who spoke 2 languages, there was a delay. Their age at onset was 60.9 and 56.2, suggesting that the effect of education and literacy and place of dwelling could be accounted for in this data set, and there still was an advantage for bilingualism. So since then, this area has been full of controversies. Different studies have shown different results. Bilingualism is not you are bilingual or monolingual. You could know a second language a little bit, you could know it very well. You could have learned it when you were a child, you could have learned it when you were much older. And then you had the confounding effect of several things like immigration and education, reverse causality, where the smarter people actually learning more than one language. And then bilingualism, even in the studies where it has shown an advantage to executive functions, has shown disadvantage to some other cognitive functions like language. So it's clearly a complex area. So we no longer should actually define bilingualism as a categorical variable. We need to study whether, when did they learn the language, how proficient are they in the language, in what context do they use the language, is there code switching? And these are 4 studies that came subsequent to our study, which demonstrated that there was no protective effect for bilingualism in a community-based study, in a clinic-based study. But you will notice that all the 4 studies were among Spanish-English bilinguals that resided in America. Subsequent studies from Europe, from China, from Wales, from demonstrated that, Luxembourg demonstrated that there was a similar delay in age at onset of dementia. So this was exciting for us because every 1 month a new study would come, we would go up, we would read it, we would discuss it, and we would see, is it supporting, not supporting, what more can you learn from the new study that has come? So this is research that is alive, that is started about maybe a couple of decades ago maximum. And so it's still very nascent and in its infancy. But it's going to look very exciting in the coming years and things will become clearer. So I was invited to the American Association for Advancement of Science to talk on bilingualism. And the day we landed there on the symposium, this is the Atlantic. This is the newspaper. And this was what the newspaper had to say, the bitter fight over the benefits of bilingualism. So this is like getting, doing work, but then trying to understand life and science. And so this was, the controversy was being discussed quite often in popular press as well. So coming back to science. As I mentioned, there is evidence that bilinguals have enhanced executive functions, especially inhibitory control and conflict resolution. But there's also evidence that there is a disadvantage to vocabulary, fluencies, naming, and linguistic processing. But there is again some evidence that suggests that it enhances our perspective taking, our ability to understand another person's point of view, while the semantic system, our concepts are thought to be common for both languages. So these are some of the advantages to executive control, as I mentioned. Disadvantages to language, these are some of the studies. Semantic memory is independent. And there's even a complex effect on decision making. I'm sure all of you know this famous trolley study where this person, you have to choose a difficult moral dilemma. So if you pull the switch, the trolley can get diverted and kill one person and save these 5 people. Would you do that or would you not? Or if you push this person down, you would still save 5 people at the cost of 1 person. And there is evidence that you make a different decision when you're asked in your mother tongue or when you're asked in a foreign language. So this is a kind of a complex effect languages have on the way we understand and perceive the world, and they also affect our decision making. So coming back to neurology, just like there are many cognitive domains, patients come to us with different complaints. Doctor, I have become forgetful. My mother is behaving oddly. I can't seem to find the right word. My husband is losing his way home. So dementia is not all memory loss. There can be some different people come with different complaints to us. So we had an opportunity to study, just like bilingualism has different effects on different cognitive processes, does it have a different effect on the different dementia subtypes? Alzheimer's disease is typically an amnestic disorder. That's a memory disorder. So as I mentioned, Alzheimer's disease is typically a memory disorder. But this was a study that I did in Cambridge, where we demonstrated that people with Alzheimer's disease can come, and therefore we would like to see how bilingualism affects these different kinds of dementia. There's another kind of dementia which I'd like to introduce you now to, that's called frontotemporal dementia, where people have problems in behavior. Their memory may be intact. For instance, this is a 56-year-old gentleman. He came with 4 years history of behavioral disturbances, just becoming tactless, distractible, hoarding, stealing, and loss of empathy, loss of rule-bound behavior. So this is frontotemporal dementia. There's another kind of dementia called non-fluent aphasia, where only language is affected. They remember things, they can go about, they understand how to do their daily activities, but they are not able to speak. So this is non-fluent aphasia, another form of dementia. This is semantic dementia, a very interesting form of dementia where they lose concepts. So if you ask a person with semantic dementia to name these pictures, in Telugu this is, he names goat avu, avu is cow. He names camel avu. He names giraffe avu, he names pig avu, he names alligator avu. So all living things are conceptually become one animal, and that's a cow because that's one of the most common animals in India. But none of the non-living things are animals. So this is semantic dementia. It's associated him, and this was Manishi, that is man. So this is one form of dementia called semantic dementia. So each dementia is different. This is dementia with Parkinsonism, where they have problems in memory, may have problems in language, but they also have movement problems. So we looked at how does bilingualism affect these different subtypes of dementia. There was a delay in age at onset of Alzheimer's disease among bilinguals, frontotemporal dementia, as well as vascular dementia. So this was something that seemed to be across dementia subtypes. Then, as I mentioned, we have different types of frontotemporal dementia. So when we looked at people with behavioral problems, people who lost empathy, people who lost, who were disinhibited, poor attention, there was a delay in age at onset of dementia among bilinguals. But there was no delay in age at onset of dementia among those who had aphasia or loss of language. That means bilingualism did not protect people who lost language first, nor did it protect people who had motor problems, Parkinsonism. But this was the first time we felt that it was not a universal effect. This was some benefit for people who had behavioral disturbances, but not necessarily for those who had language disturbances. Then we looked into the third study. Does it protect in very early forms of mild cognitive impairment? Yes, it did. Does it protect in a non-degenerative dementia like stroke? And we found that people who were bilingual, after they had a stroke, were more likely to have normal cognition compared to people who were monolingual, who were more often likely to have vascular dementia. And they can see the cognitive scores for bilinguals were higher. So this was reviewed in Nature Reviews Neurology. And what was acknowledged was the fact that India is a good place to study bilingualism because it's devoid of several confounding factors and it's normative here. And then we looked at post-stroke aphasia. Again, bilinguals had better cognition after developing aphasia. We went into schools, primary schools. This is 461 children in Hyderabad school. They did better on the Reven's test if they spoke one language at home and they had another language in class. So kind of, this was bilingualism and cognitive decline. This is one of the articles for those of you who watched Pride and Prejudice. This is an older version. So you have people saying public health policy should remove recommendations regarding bilingualism as a strategy. But at the same time, there are others saying that if the entire relevant literature is considered, it becomes clear that there is considerable empirical support for bilingual effect on dementia of a size to which no pharmacological intervention can yet aspire. This was quite recent, 2017. One way to deal with this is to study the brain. Is there a neural basis for bilingual? Are the brains of bilinguals structurally, functionally different? So there seemed to be some evidence that people who were bilingual, in spite of having more atrophy, probably could cope better. They had better white matter tract integrity when they were healthy. So there is now evidence suggesting that both white matter integrity and gray matter volumes are higher in bilinguals when they're healthy, and they're less when they become diseased, suggesting that they're able to cope better. So what are the mechanisms that underlie these protective effects? Neuroplasticity. I see a question in the chat box about plasticity. So life course confers on us changes in the brain that allow us, that remodel it. And that is neuroplasticity at a structural level. And this occurs along with degeneration. And in this is our opportunity to study the role of bilingualism as a factor that improves resilience. But it's not just bilingualism. Education can induce neuroplasticity, sports, skilled activities, playing a musical instrument, meditation, social networking, all of these factors. Taxi drivers, we all know the famous London taxi driver study, where they had larger hippocampal volumes because they had better spatial memory and spatial cognition. So therefore, neuroplasticity indeed is one of the mechanisms that is thought to underlie the protective effects of bilingualism. This gives us an opportunity to study and explore this further, while different studies are giving different results. So these are some of the studies that have shown that cortical thickness is higher in bilinguals with Alzheimer's disease. Volumes in the subcortical areas are more, better connectivity, reduced metabolism. So this again suggests that this may be the mechanism that underlies the bilingual protective effect. So this is a study that we did recently. This is under review, where we looked at frontotemporal dementia patients. We found that bilinguals had greater thickness in the dorsolateral frontal areas and the right parietal cortex, but less thickness in the left temporoparietal language areas, consistent with our clinical studies. White matter integrity in bilinguals, there seemed to be better intra and interhemispheric connectivity among bilinguals with dementia. But it's very important to study it in the context of other life course factors. So we try to disentangle effects of education, literacy, and bilingualism. So we had 4 groups: illiterate monolinguals, low literate monolinguals, low literate bilingual, and high literate bilingual. We found differences only between illiterate monolinguals and high literate bilinguals. Again, this is therefore a complex area. You can't just conveniently pull out one variable and study it when our brains are affected by so many different life course experiences. So this is a study on education and bilingualism, demonstrating that bilinguals with dementia had lesser cortical thickness, again supporting the cognitive reserve hypothesis that they're able to cope better. So this was a clinic study that we did. Illiterates, yes, had an earlier age at onset. But when we did the modeling, general linear model, bilingualism effect stayed. Rural dwelling was a risk factor. Stroke was a risk factor, but the effect of education disappeared. So we're wondering what happened. Turns out that many of our illiterate people were actually engaged in complex activities like craft. So they have been doing some other complex skill. So though they could not read and write, they had something else that protected their brain. So that is why their age at onset was not as early as the unskilled illiterates. And therefore, to put this in context of dementia again, 40% of risk factors for dementia today are modifiable. So we can make a difference. We can protect the brain of our elderly people. We can protect our brain starting from midlife. But it's very important to study the cultural brain to understand resilience, because many of these activities like education, occupation, social activities, exercise, they're all diet, they're all linked to culture. And you have to study bilingualism not as a dichotomous variable, but as a more complex, nuanced variable. Experience. We have to study young, middle-aged, old. You have to study disease. You have to study acute disease processes. You have to study it within one ethnicity, across ethnicities. You have to use biomarkers. So this is all this work that's happening. I'm kind of coming to the end of the talk, and it has to be studied in the context of all other experiences that drive neuroplasticity. And this can be done, and work is going on. It can be studied in relation to experiences that affect brain health, like so many other life course factors. Why is this relevant? Because we are one world, but our experiences are different. This is the education map. This is the occupation map. This is the bilingualism profile. This is the differences in cultures. And the center graph tells you that the prevalence of dementia is different in different countries. And we don't know how much of that is because of the different lifestyles that different societies have. Therefore, to conclude, studying the relationship between bilingualism and dementia provides valuable insights into the mechanisms that underlie cognitive reserve. It's important to study complex interactions in diverse settings. And there's a need for us to study interdisciplinary manner, longitudinal studies using multiple modalities, social, biological, psychological, molecular, to address the existing gaps in understanding relationship between bilingualism and resilience. I'd like to introduce you to several members of the team that have done most of the work. My mentor, John Hodges in Cambridge, Dr. Subhash Kaul in Hyderabad, Thomas Bach in Edinburgh, my collaborator, Shailaja, who worked with me in bilingualism in Hyderabad, and in Bangalore, Nitin, he's a student who's doing his PhD on bilingualism, and Avanti, who's a speech and language pathologist. So we have social workers, we have psychologists, we have speech and language, we have a statistician, Feba, who does all our statistics. Social worker, she provides care, Dr. Priya with her team. She's very important. No research without clinical care is my motto. So you have to provide care. So if you're working in research in any area, please attach yourself to a hospital. At least see the people whom you are studying. Darshini, speech and language pathologist. Sunil and Raghavendra are our imaging students. So you can see they're all very young and they're doing most of the work, and I'm getting to give their talks. So with that, I end.